Good afternoon. Welcome to today's Roundtable, Public Safety in Native Communities. I want to thank everybody for participating and logging on. Today we're going to talk about how the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization, the Not Invisible Act, the Savannas Act will improve public safety in Native communities. We will also discuss what more Congress can do to further strengthen public safety resources for Native communities. I'll kick things off with questions in a minute, but first I want to go over some housekeeping matters on remote participation. For panelists, members will be able to see you on WebEx and call you accordingly. I'll ask that you remain on mute until you are recognized. Panelists should feel free to request recognition even if the question is not directed to them. Just be sure to raise your hand so that we can recognize you and make sure you're on the monitor for everybody to see. Please also identify yourself as you start to speak, at least the first time, so that our court reporter accurately picks up who is speaking. And now for introductions. Let me begin with Mark Kavika Patterson, Chair of the Hawaii State Correctional Systems Oversight Commission and the Administrator of the Hawaii Youth Correctional Facility. Aloha and welcome. Are there any other senators wishing to recognize a panelist?
Mr. Chairman.
Vice Chairman Kowski.
Mr. Chairman, I want to recognize and thank Alex Cleghorn for participating today. Alex is the Senior Legal and Policy Director with the Alaska Native Justice Center. ANJC has done a great job working and partnering with Alaska tribes to strengthen self-determination and sovereignty to build tribal citizens. He's been working with many other advocates and are planning ways to build tribal court capacity and prepare for implementation of the Alaska pilot, which is, of course, very, very important work. So I thank him for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Senator Lujan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Vice Chairman Kowski for holding this important roundtable discussion on public safety needs in Native communities. And thank you to our distinguished panelists for joining us today. It's my honor to introduce Navajo Nation Council Delegate Eugenia Charles Newton on today's panel. She is the chairwoman of the Navajo Nation Law and Order Committee and also serves as the chairwoman of the U.S. Tribal Interior Budget Council Subcommittee on Public Safety and Justice. Before her election to the Navajo Nation Council, she worked for the Navajo Nation Department of Justice as a prosecutor for 3 years. She is an accomplished academic and lawyer, holding a Juris Doctorate, Master's, and PhD in philosophy. Chairwoman Charles Newton lives in Shiprock, New Mexico, with her husband Leroy, and is a proud mother to Jacob. Her clans are within his cover: Red Bottom People, Salt People, and Water Edge clans. Chairwoman, thank you for being with us today, and I'm so proud to have your expertise and passion here with us today. It's an honor to be with you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If there are no other members to introduce our panelists, I'll proceed. We have Michael Ford, the Chief of Police from Reno Sparks Indian Colony in Reno, Nevada. We also have Tracy Canard, the Senior Advisor of the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs at the U.S. Department of Interior. Jason O'Neill, the Director of Bureau of Indian Affairs at the Office of Justice Services at the U.S. Department of Interior. Robert Chapman, Acting Director, Community-Oriented Policing Service at U.S. DOJ. Lucy Rain Simpson, Executive Director of National Indigenous Women's Resource Center in Lame Deer, Montana. And Nikki Borchardt Campbell, the Executive Director of National American Indian Court Judges Association in Boulder, Colorado. Welcome to you all. I want to make some opening remarks and then turn it over to the Vice Chair, and then she'll start with her questions. The federal government's systemic under-resourcing of public safety needs is just one barrier to safe and healthy Native communities. A complex criminal jurisdictional scheme and the U.S. government's centuries-old failure to fulfill its trust obligations contribute to the immense challenges Native communities face when it comes to keeping their citizens and community members safe. But with the recent reauthorization of VAWA, the enactment of the Not Invisible Act and Savannas Act, Native communities and their federal partners in DOI and DOJ now have more tools and resources to improve how justice is served. And so I look forward to today's dialogue, and we do want it to be a dialogue. I know it's a little, it's a formal setting under the committee's jurisdiction, but we do want to have a little bit more of a give and take conversation about how these laws will improve public safety in Native communities and what more Congress can do to address unmet public safety needs. I'll now recognize the Vice Chair for any opening statement and her initial questions. Vice Chair.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate this roundtable. The issue of public safety is one We can call this a roundtable, but let me tell you, people back home are talking about it at their dinner tables. This is very real and very, very troubling in too many parts of my state and across Indian country and has been for a long time. I have shared with the committee that we have seen studies and news reports that have documented the public safety crisis in my state. 1 in 3 Alaska Native villages lack any law enforcement presence. So think about what that means when there is no law enforcement presence. These communities that have no presence then have no justice. When you think about those communities that are off the road system, almost 4 times as many sex offenders per capita compared to the national average. We, again, I've shared this with committee members, but we had then Attorney General Barr out to Alaska, came to visit the small village of Napaskiak. This was back in 2019. He looked around, he listened, he declared a law enforcement emergency. He stated that the isolation of Alaska villages contributes to law enforcement problems not seen anywhere else in our nation. And he made this declaration of emergency in recognition that, quote, Alaska has the highest per capita crime rate in the country and the unique circumstances of Alaska's geographical and jurisdictional landscape. And so we've been trying to build on the momentum of that designation since that time. Of course, COVID didn't help in our efforts. We saw just further ramped up instances of domestic violence, 5 domestic violence homicides in only 10 days in rural Alaska. The number of calls to our domestic violence shelters increased 52%. We know in this committee all too well the disproportionate number of missing and murdered individuals within the American Indian and Alaska Native population. The steps that we have taken here as a committee with the Not Invisible Act, the Savannahs Act, what we did with the bipartisan effort and a good, strong effort on the reauthorization of VAWA 2020. I think we're moving in the right direction as we look to how we can address this public safety crisis in meaningful ways. I was very proud to see last week 3 Alaska women were appointed to the Not Invisible Commission. Michelle Demmert, Tammy Giroux, Vivian Corthius. They're going to do a fabulous job and provide valuable perspective to that commission. But as we think about the VAWA reauthorization and all that is going to mean across Indian country, I'm very thankful that we were able to move out of this committee a strong, expanded tribal title and do so in a way that was bipartisan. We have a very unique and complex jurisdictional landscape in Alaska as a result of the Alaskan Native Claims Settlement. And because of that legal framework, we were effectively, Alaska tribes were effectively left out of VAWA 2013. But working with advocates across the state and in response to really years of a lot of good work there, we were able to include the Alaska Public Safety Empowerment Pilot Project to help tribes in Alaska provide for public safety and justice in our native villages. And so now we get to the implementation part. This is the hard part, but I am confident that Alaska tribes are up to the job. They're good partners. They will be good partners with the state, just as we have seen the tribes in the lower 48 do as they're providing safety in Native communities. In addition to empowering tribal courts, resources are critical, of course. We included in the omnibus spending bill last year an increase of $5 million for cold cases and MMIW activities, also an increase of $4 million for tribal courts in PL 280 states. So we're making some headway there. But I hope that with this roundtable today we can have a broader discussion about what do we need on the capacity side? What do we need to really strengthen our tribal justice systems? So, Mr. Cleghorn, I'm going to ask you to start out. And again, thank you for your work and the work of the team at the Alaska Native Justice Center as you focused on how we strengthen self-determination of Alaska tribes. So what do we do? What more can we do to strengthen tribal justice systems in Alaska? And maybe the way to start the conversation is to share the main challenges that we're seeing with our tribes in Alaska as they have worked over the years to develop justice systems. So it's kind of a broad question, but it gives you room to run here, Alex, and I know you can field this and many of the other questions that we'll have.
Well, thank you, Senator Murkowski. And I do want to start by thanking this committee and you and Senator Schatz for holding this roundtable and for your efforts in VAWA. It has been long fought, and we know that the hard work starts now. And I'll take the question in two parts, right? So what have the challenges been? I think the challenges have been, in addition to what you laid out, a real lack of understanding of the impacts of ANCSA and Public Law 280 upon tribes, and the difference in our land status not being 1151A Indian country. And while the pilot project is important and exciting, I think that 813A is not to be overlooked here, right? That reaffirmation of inherent authority, and now the Alaska-specific land-based definition for personal jurisdiction that we were lacking. And I think that is something that we will be clearly communicating to state partners throughout the state around the scope of authority that tribes do have now. And I think that in addition to the challenges around understanding, confusion around the status of tribes and their inherent authority, funding has been a real challenge. And here, I think it's helpful to contrast what Alaska tribes and tribal organizations have been able to do with our tribal health system, with consistent funding, tribal authority, and self-determination. We have a tribal health system that all Alaska Native people, in large part, are proud of, that is an example of what self-determination can do and what it looks like.
So if I can interrupt there, because I think your point about understanding and a little bit of education here, I think it is important to remember that for our pilot, it's not just any tribe can now move forward and exercise this special criminal jurisdiction. An interested Alaska tribe has to apply to the Department of Justice to participate. There's a preference for villages that have a population that's predominantly Indian and that lack a permanent state law enforcement presence, because we want to get out to the remote rural villages. The tribes will have to meet the criteria set by DOJ, which will include having a tribal justice system that can adequately safeguard the rights of the defendants. I know that there's been some discussion or perhaps confusion in the state where a tribe located just outside of the Anchorage municipality, there was confusion between what they are trying to do with areas of law enforcement and whether or not it fits within what we're doing with a special pilot. And I think it is something that goes back to just an understanding of what we have established through the pilot program and what some of the existing authorities are. So we're talking about funding, which is so important when you talk about the consistency of funding, because as you know, we kind of fight every year for a little meager plus up in PL 280 funding. It used to be that Alaska's PL 280 states didn't get tribal court funding. So we're starting to work our way in, but there's no consistency to any of this. So there's a couple, a comment to you on the funding side, but also a comment that I might have you respond to just with greater understanding as to what we're hoping to accomplish with our special tribal jurisdiction.
Well, and thank you for highlighting that, Senator. I think that we've begun getting the word out. I think that that is a long road in being very clear about the pilot project and the sideboards that are around that the tribes in Alaska that are interested in doing that. First, we've got the two-part preference, and then we have the same kind of process or questions that need to be answered as tribes in the lower 48. And those are the Indian Civil Rights Act concerns, making sure that when we're talking about building, establishing, reaffirming tribal criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians, that all of those are in place. This is not something that is automatic. There's not a light switch that has now been turned on. What is available to Alaska tribes in the pilot project is the runway, that we are no longer shut out, and that we can have tribes who are interested and ready to start moving down that runway. And so we are excited to be involved in that process in whatever way is helpful. And you raised the question also of confusion. I think that there continues to be real misunderstanding throughout the state on some core issues, including whether or not Alaska has tribes. And that any opportunity we can share the basic fundamentals that there are tribes in Alaska, that their jurisdiction is clear, and that ANCSA did not terminate tribes, and that tribes are not all of a sudden, because of the pilot project, going to be exercising criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians. I think that meeting people where they're at, providing clear factual information and answering questions, and also trying to help keep the temperature low, right? Sometimes this gets to be a very heated discussion and people have concerns. I think that part of ANJC's role is as a trusted place of information for those that have those kinds of concerns.
Well, and we thank you for that, and again for the leadership that ANJC provides here. I am hopeful that our legislature is going to. Well, I believe they have passed the legislation that would allow for that tribal recognition, and hopefully that is signed by the governor. But again, that's happening on the state side. Mr. Chairman, I think that it's not just in Alaska that we are focusing on what we need to be doing to build tribal capacity in order to implement special criminal jurisdiction. I know that you have tribes across the country that might have some good and helpful ideas, best practices that we can look to in Alaska. I might ask Nikki Borchardt Campbell from the American Indian Court Judges Association if she's got any advice for us on how we build out the capacity. But I know my colleagues are also waiting for an opportunity to raise questions. But if she might speak to that quickly, and then we can move to others.
Absolutely. Thank you. With regard to trying to build out capacity with our tribal justice systems, that's always a tricky question, only because when we're thinking about the special tribal criminal jurisdiction, it's multifaceted. So we need to understand that we need to build out our codes. We need to review and revise codes. We need to support our justice systems and ensure that we have sufficiently trained judges, which we do. and also support those justice system personnel as well in order to make sure that they're understanding the types of cases that are coming in and support those technology needs as well. In addition, we have some amazing courts and justice systems who went through the initial pilot program in 2013 and who have been working with the Intertribal Work Group with the National Congress of American Indians and other organizations who have been meeting quite frequently to discuss the capacity needs, the capacity issues, and have been sharing those best practices in monthly calls and in regular trainings. And additionally, we also make sure that our tribal court judges are not only receiving the nuts and bolts of what they need to know about managing cases, hearing certain types of cases, and addressing those criminal justice needs in their communities. But we're also looking at innovative practices as well. So what are the best types of interventions based on these types of cases? And then they're also leading from the bench. They're looking at the types of cases coming through. They're looking at the data. They're looking at the community. And they're leading from the bench by trying to create specialty courts. They're trying to create solutions in addition to of course, just leading in an adversarial way. And so I know that we might talk a little bit more about, restorative justice and traditional justice practices, but those types of things are also coming into play when we're talking about preventative services and really trying to help families. And like Mr. Cleghorn said, meeting people where they are and really trying to address some of those underlying issues that are bringing individuals into the justice system to begin with.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I really appreciate this hearing. I want to also just say to our Vice Chair, I so appreciate your leadership on these issues of missing and murdered Indigenous women for so long. I've been thinking as this committee hearing started about our colleague Heidi Heidkamp, and about how fiercely she fought on these issues to advance these issues, and how fiercely she would be sitting here right now and talking about how important it is that this is implemented well. And so with that in mind, I'm going to ask kind of a specific question and then a more general question. And Ms. Simpson, I'll start with you. So I think that we have taken important steps to address the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous people with Savannah's Act and the Not Invisible Act. I also was so grateful that the Justice for Native Survivors of Sexual Violence Act, which I worked on with members of this committee, which empowers tribes to prosecute additional crimes of sexual violence committed by non-Native perpetrators on tribal lands. So, Ms. Simpson, if you could, I want to just go to that. In my mind, this is a model which gets exactly what we should be doing, which is to recognize that tribes are going to know best how to address the public safety issues that they see in their communities. Could you talk to us, Ms. Simpson, about the impact of this special tribal criminal jurisdiction, and maybe just what's going to get in the way of this getting implemented the way we all want to see it implemented?
So, there we go. Thank you. Thank you, Senator Smith, and the committee for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I appreciate your attention to these important issues. I think going back to some of what Alex Cleghorn said about what's going to get in the way of being able to implement, it is really going to be some of that ignorance about tribes' abilities to provide justice within their communities. I think that's going to be, an ongoing concern. That was a lot of what we faced through the fixes to jurisdiction as they went through Congress, was questions from places where there were no tribes about tribes' ability to be fair in the way that they pursue justice within their community. So I think there's a lot of ongoing education about the quality of our tribal justice systems, about the competency of our judges, of our court personnel, to be able to administer justice within our communities for our own people and those people that live within our tribal communities that might not be tribal members. So I think that's going to be one of the primary issues that is just going to be ongoing, that we're going to have to continue to face and address as we move forward. And yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you. And is there anything in particular, any guidance in particular that you want to give us in terms of what we should be doing at the federal level to support tribes that are making, that are wanting to use this special criminals jurisdiction?
Well, I think, I think there's so many different things that in order to address justice and safety for our Native communities that we need to address. And a big part of that is going to be the way that even with this special jurisdiction and hopefully a full Oliphant fix coming in the future as we move down the road, there are the recent reauthorization restored tribal jurisdiction over non-Indian perpetrators of sexual violence, stalking, child abuse, sex trafficking, and assault against justice personnel, in addition to domestic and dating violence. But it left some pretty serious gaps in there, relating to drug-related crimes and other crimes that co-occur with domestic and sexual violence, including elder abuse, which I think is a big priority for our Native communities, is protecting our elders, who are our culture bearers. Financial crimes, and then of course homicide, which connects us to the larger missing and murdered Indigenous women movement.
So you're touching on the second thing that I wanted to ask about. I have such vivid memories of going up to the Red Lake Nation in northern Minnesota, a very remote, large Ojibwe nation, and hearing Chair Darrell Seekey tell me about how individuals would come onto tribal land and commit, sell drugs, commit drug-related offenses in particular, with, virtual impunity, because the county would come and, come and if they did anything, they would take that individual non-native person, off of tribal land and then let them go, and then that would be kind of the end of it. And so my question is, and maybe this is something particularly really for anybody, is we all sit here knowing the huge complications to public safety in Indian country because of the Oliphant decision, essentially eliminating the tribe's ability to prosecute crimes of non-native offenders on their lands, and how much that has hurt public safety for tribal communities. So I'm wondering if anybody on the panel would like to comment more broadly on how the Oliphant decision is impacting your work as you try to provide strong public safety in your communities. Maybe this is a good question for Ms. Charles Newton or Mr. Ford.
Hi, this is Delegate Charles Newton. I'm not sure exactly what the protocol is in addressing the questions that do get addressed to us, but I do want to thank Senator Lujan for asking me to take part in this roundtable. I can say that as a former prosecutor and also as a council delegate, a lawmaker at this time, we are running into obvious issues. We need to increase our resources for law enforcement to dramatically increase the number of officers that are serving on the reservation. I think that we have heard the stories about what's happening here within Indian country when it comes to violence against natives. A lot of that does stem from drug traffickers, who know that Indian country, has far too, too few officers, and especially with the size of some of our nations, our reservations, it does make it an issue. So one of the issues that we ran into is the fact that FBI and US DOJ, they consistently decline to investigate and prosecute those types of crimes that are happening in Indian country. And here on the Navajo Nation, we can't really pay our officers competitively as those off the Navajo Nation. And so it does run into an issue because we don't have as many officers, and at the same time, we do depend on the U.S. Department of Justice and the FBI to help assist, but they're oftentimes not there to help. So I think if I may, Senator, offer the suggestion that we start working to increase the resources for law enforcement on the Navajo Nation, and possibly enter into something that holds our U.S. Department of Justice and our FBI more accountable. We continue to have our cases falling through the cracks with no explanation. So I think it would be really important to start asking those tough questions about, why this is happening and why they routinely decline to investigate and prosecute those types of crimes in Indian country. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I'll yield back. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Senator Lujan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Vice Chair. The Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Department of Justice have stood up online pages that list open missing and murdered Indigenous persons cases. The BIA's website lists 13 cases, and the Department of Justice lists 48. Now, Miss Ali Mae Begay went missing from the Navajo Nation in June of 2021, but her and over 9,500 missing Native people logged in the NCIC Missing and Unidentified Persons Report are not listed in either database. So my question, Mr. O'Neill, is why are there so few cases in both databases?
Well, thank you for the question, Senator Lujan. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this roundtable today. While I can't answer for the FBI, I can tell you that the BIA did collaborate with FBI during the development of our MMU website. Theirs, of course, was up and operational long before ours. And one of our joint goals was to make sure that we weren't duplicating efforts. FBI highlights cases that they're actively working on. And so that was a goal we had, was to ensure that our initial cases when we launched our website were cases that our missing and murdered unit had reviewed, and we're opening active investigations or reopening investigations that were unresolved. Shortly after the launch of our website, one of our critical employees who was responsible for data entry accepted a position with another federal agency. And just this past month, we've rehired a new employee. That employee is being trained up to not only resume adding case information to our existing cases on that website, but also to add the additional cases that our missing and murdered units engaged in right now.
So, Mr. O'Neill, if you add both together to prevent duplication, that gets you to 61, 13 and 48. That's far short of 9,500. Would you agree?
Yes, sir.
And understanding that someone that had the responsibility left, how long has this new person been on board?
Our new program analyst came on board 2 weeks ago.
It's been 13 cases for some time. And it's something that my office is monitoring. So if this is a tool, right now it's doing damage in my opinion. It's not helping folks to convince them that there's only 13 active cases when we know that there's 9,500. And the goal of all of us is to bring more attention here. Undermining this is going to show that, oh, don't worry, we got it under control. No one needs to do anything. And that's terribly wrong. So I'm hoping that there'll be more attention on this and priority, and really more than one staffer that will have the responsibility of maintaining something to get it up to speed. And then once you get the cases entered, if you need to back off, then back off. The follow-up I have there, Mr. O'Neill, is, in one word, if you would, are the open cases of the 13 currently on the BIA website, are the open cases active or cold?
They are active.
What has the BIA done to help the Department of Justice implement the provision of Savannah's Act that requires publishing gender data?
So Savannah's Act required FBI to include gender in its annual statistics, which it publishes on its website. One of the things we've done to help support that, and as directed by the FBI back in January of 2021, is we helped Indian Country transition from the Uniform Crime Report summary reporting system to the National Incident-Based Reporting System. BIA worked with FBI to create a new tribal collection application so that tribes could enter their crime data, their monthly crime data, into that database. And that access is actually hosted on the FBI's LEAP portal, that's their Law Enforcement Enterprise portal. And so that data and crime data that each of the tribes is reporting each month is now being direct inputted into those federal databases. Tribes have access to that data as well as our federal partners and BIA so we can continue to analyze that crime data.
And it's my understanding, Council Delegate Charles Newton, you'd like to respond to that question.
Yes, thank you. As Senator Lujan, I would like to add that one of the issues that we run into here on Navajo is that the process is not very clear. There are some times when people are reported missing, but because they're over the age of 18, they're not considered to be missing. And we have on multiple occasions run into that issue here on Navajo Nation where families have reported individuals as missing, but they've only been told that they're not missing because they could have gone somewhere. Maybe they just don't want to contact family to let them know where they're at. And so we do run into that issue here on Navajo is because of the age. And oftentimes we don't have officers actually listening to the families. So I do want to just add that into this mix, Senator Lujan, that the process is not very clear in that we don't know for sure who can be added into the NCIC list. Thank you.
Council Delegate, I very much appreciate your experience here in helping to explain this again, and it shows there's more work that must be done so that there's clear data that is being captured and reflected in this. And Mr. Chairman, while my time is over and I will submit the remainder of these questions into the record, one that I did want to ask Mr. O'Neill is around facilities. Now, the Navajo Nation was forced to close the Shiprock Detention Facility in Window Rock, New Mexico, at the police headquarters several years ago because the buildings posed health and safety risks. Now, I want to thank Council Delegate Eugenia for inviting me, and we both visited those buildings, and she's invited several other leaders. Now, the president's budget includes $70.3 million for public safety and justice construction and states that detention centers have the highest funding priority. My question, Mr. O'Neill, is yes or no, within the amount of $70.3 million, does that include the $22.25 million requested for the new pilot PS&J construction site assessment and capital investment pilot prioritize the Shiprock Detention Facility on the Navajo Nation?
Senator Lujan, I appreciate that question. And I don't have an answer for you at this roundtable, but I'll make sure that our team follows up and gets back with you on that question.
I appreciate that. I'm sure they're watching, Mr. O'Neill. If they could call my office and let me know, because someone has a chart in front of them, and if they could call my office before I return, I'd really appreciate that. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you. Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, everyone. So pleased to have this roundtable. I apologize for the delay. I was actually on a conference call with Chairman Melendez and some of our tribal leaders. So I didn't get an opportunity to introduce the Chief of Police for Reno-Sparks Indian Colony, Michael Ford. I'm so pleased that you are joining us. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member Makowski for holding this important roundtable today. I think it is important as we focus on the needs of our Native communities, what we can do to continue to support our tribal police and keep these communities safe. We also know that many tribal communities don't have police officers, and they are challenged with accessing resources to support their needs as well. So let me start with a question to Chief Ford. Chief Ford, I understand that one of the biggest challenges you face as chief is recruiting and retaining officers to keep your community safe. And you may have done this in the introduction, but can you please describe the difficulty you've experiencing with hiring and retaining officers and what factors play into that?
Thank you very much for that question, Senator. And also thank you, Chair, Vice Chair, and Committee for your indulgence today. Michael Ford, Tribal Police Chief with the Reno-Sparks Indian Colony. Some of the challenges that we're seeing here is that we have to be able to offer competitive wages and benefits and retirement to officers. Often we are participants in COPS programs where we can hire officers and purchase equipment. But once we reach a 3 to 5 year range with officers, sometimes they have to make other decisions that are better suited for their career and for their family. And it takes a considerable amount of time to train and equip and make an officer prepared to go out into the field. And so we kind of go through these cycles where we train and we equip and we prepare. And then when we have an officer fully prepared, then we lose that person and we start all over again. So if we're looking at a 5-year grant cycle, within that 5 years, although we may have hired some officers, by the time we reach that end, we're kind of starting all over. And that makes it really difficult for the type of work that we want to do in the community, building the relationship with community members, building trust, and also having experienced officers who are working so that we can address some of the issues that we're talking about today, such as MMIW. It's really important to have experienced officers, but it's hard to do it if we can't keep them. And then when it comes to hiring and recruiting, you have to imagine that there are a lot of opportunities out there for officers, and so they do look at those opportunities. And sometimes looking at working for a tribal agency is not one of those better options when they're looking at what it is for their career. I guess there's a myriad of other reasons why people make a decision to leave, but it is hard to start over every year when you lose competent officers. And I've even lost some officers who are community members here who've had to make decisions at a 3 to 5 year mark to go to work for non-tribal agencies, and I lose that experience. I lose that connection with the community. And every year, usually around January or February, I'm trying to replace 2 or 3. And then we go through about a year or two where we're not in crisis. And but we're at one of those points now where we're down about 5 officers. I'm down 1 ranger. I'm down a record specialist. So it's very difficult to run the business of a police department when you can't hire and recruit and retain staff.
Right. And I would imagine some of the others have the same problems. What I hear from my tribal chiefs throughout the state of Nevada is just what you said. It sounds like you're training these officers and then they go work for another law enforcement organization because there may be higher wages or better benefits. And that's the challenge we have. Chief, can I ask you recommendations on how you could retain them? I mean, clearly, I think what I also hear from the tribal chief and law enforcement is the grant funding is great, but it always obviously doesn't last forever. And then oftentimes there's a match or some sort of additional resources you have to put up to support. And even if you wanted to provide more resources, you still have to provide the equipment and the training. And there's that costs money as well. So I'm curious, Chief Ford and anyone else, what should we know in Congress? How do we help you keep and retain these officers?
I would, I guess my response would be understanding what the need is to have the correct policy fit. Because I mean, there are a lot of great programs out there that really are supportive to tribal law enforcement, and so the money is there, and we use it for the purchase of vehicles. We use it for initial hires, but we also are kind of locked in where we can't adjust as rapidly as agencies outside of tribal communities to have competitive wages and to have competitive benefit packages. I think one thing that a lot of programs struggle with across tribal law enforcement is the fact that if your community doesn't have the money to enter into a state retirement system, that if you're a tribal officer, let's say you're working in a 688 program, you can work there 30 years and essentially not have a retirement. And so that makes it a very difficult situation for those individuals as officers, as community members, and they've got to make some tough decisions. So without being able to have competitive wages and equal benefits, it's very hard to keep officers.
Right. I see a hand raised, Mr. Chairman, if it's all right, Delegate Charles Newton.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be on this roundtable. We've had this discussion multiple times with Senator Lujan and also Senator Heinrich, so I do appreciate the opportunity again. I would like to add on that we are experiencing the same issue here on Navajo Nation. We did come up with 2 recommendations, and one recommendation is to lower the age. Right now, it's you have to be 21 years old to be able to become a police officer on the Navajo Nation, and we're asking to lower that age to 18 because one of the issues that our nation is facing is that we do have an increased number of people who are applying for these positions in law enforcement. However, they can't pass the background check. And a lot of it is because they might get into trouble from the time that they're 18 to the time that they turn 21 in that time frame. And so we have requested to BIA to lower that age to 18 or to create a program like a deputy program where these individuals could ride around with older officers to gain the experience, and then also to make sure that they are that they're covered. We argued that we have a lot of our military recruiters coming into our high schools, recruiting right out of high school. When, as soon as they turn 18, they start, they can actually join the military. So we're hoping that we could do the same thing. That's one recommendation. The second recommendation is to allow for some of the BIA fundings. And this was actually approved, but we're waiting for the written document to be sent to us by BIA Office of Justice Services. And that is to use some of the funding that we don't use in filling the positions to be used towards not salary increases, but kind of like bonuses. So retention bonuses. So if you sign on, you'll get $1,000 bonus or a $2,000 bonus. Or the second one is, the retention bonus, which is if you're an officer for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, you get a bonus in that. And so I think that would help with, being competitive in terms of the salary, and how we're not able to meet that salary increase. But this also leads to a very important issue, and I believe that Senator Lujan touched upon that, and that's the data that is needed for each one of the tribes to justify funding. We don't have a across the board database that would help us to track a lot of this information that's happening within our nations, to be able to report that to Congress to say, here's our numbers, this is what we're facing. I know as a tribal leader, I have to oftentimes pull data from IHS, pull data from BIA, pull data from FBI, and try to put all that together to try to, justify against some of those costs. I just want to touch upon that. Thank you.
Thank you. Very helpful. I see one other hand up. Is that right? Yes. Mr. Chapman?
Hi, this is Rob Chapman with the COPS Office, the Department of Justice Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services. I just wanted to thank you, Senator Cortez Masto, for this important line of questions, and Chief Ford for your insightful comments and recommendations. I just like to say that from COPS experience with law enforcement across the nation, we know that law enforcement officer recruitment and retention remains one of the most significant challenges for agencies. And this, unfortunately, is particularly acute in Indian country and tribal law enforcement agencies. We are looking at ways that we can help alleviate some of those challenges for tribal law enforcement. And Chief, we were honored to support you and your agency with a ranger, I believe, a couple years ago.
I'm going to have to interrupt. I've been called to the floor. I think it's a close vote, and they do need me on the floor immediately. I think Senator Murkowski is en route back. Senator Cortez Masto, please feel free to take your time with additional questions, but there may be a brief moment where during which none of us are here because there's a floor vote, and I'll be right back as soon as I can. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Please, Mr. Chapman, if you want to continue.
Thank you, ma'am. To address the challenge of officer recruitment and hiring, the COPS office for tribal grantees did extend the hiring awards under the Tribal Resources Grant Program that COPS administers to 5 years, as Chief Ford mentioned, to provide a more sustained period to fund those officer positions and absorb those into the agencies. However, we recognize that the challenges remain, whether it be after 3 years or 5 years. We are looking to provide other resources, and I would point to our law enforcement microgrants this year, which offers innovative funding, an innovative funding pool for agencies to implement pilot projects on recruitment and hiring. So if you would need a little bit of seed money to implement those recruitment and hiring efforts, that is one other source of funding. And we also offer technical assistance on recruitment. We have the Department of Justice's and COPS Office Collaborative Reform Initiative Technical Assistance Center, or CRITAC, is our technical assistance delivery mechanism. It's a for the field, by the field delivery of training and TA. It's free of charge. We are offering assistance to agencies on recruitment efforts, and we've been able to help several tribal agencies with their police officer hiring and recruitment initiatives. So those are just a few of the things that we have going on, both in terms of funding and technical assistance at COPS.
Thank you. Thank you. Is it Mr. Simpson? I see your hand raised. Miss Simpson, I'm sorry, you got your hair in a ponytail. It's hard to tell in the Zooms. Miss Simpson.
Okay, thank you. I think something that just more broadly and more generally also needs to be addressed is the sense of trust that law enforcement has in our communities. For the most part, in a lot of Native communities where we have limited law enforcement, the ability to respond appropriately is limited on, in a best case scenario, because there aren't enough law enforcement. On the other end of the spectrum, we have a case here in Montana on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation where a BIA law enforcement officer raped a Northern Cheyenne woman in her home, and BIA is now arguing that, or the Montana Department, U.S. Attorney's Office is arguing that BIA has no responsibility because he was doing something outside of his authority as a law enforcement officer. That impacts people's trust in our law enforcement. That impacts people's willingness to want to be a part of that when law enforcement act as bullies. We also, people who are wanting to see positive change in their community might not want to go down that route. So I think we also need to do a lot of work of community, building a relationship between community members and our law enforcement. Oftentimes the only relationship that law enforcement has, and again, best case scenario, they're so busy, they don't have the opportunity. There's so few of them, they may not have the opportunity to build a relationship with their community members. But if there is not a relationship, there's not going to be trust. That's not only going to impact the willingness of people wanting to pursue these positions because they've got an idea of what law enforcement is, and that's a negative idea of them being bullies, and then on the other, and that just trickles down to the point where we get people not wanting to even report, and that impacts data. So building trust with our law enforcement, I think, is something that we need to be able to have some resources put into that relationship. And that is only going to improve law enforcement, improve safety on every level within our communities. And I think that's lacking.
Thank you. Very helpful. Mr. Cleghorn, I notice your hand is up as well.
Thank you, Senator. I wanted to share some thoughts about the funding issue, which in PL 280 states is, underlying this recruitment retention issue that you raised, and share our belief that funding and access to funding should be as simple and flexible as possible in order to make sure that there's effective dissemination of these important resources. The challenges that accompany competitive grant processes are well documented. Funding's never guaranteed, and funding losses or requirements to implement new approaches can make it really difficult to have continuity in services and to allow programs to reach their full potential. In many tribal communities, it can take years for programs to mature and demonstrate positive impacts. And so when there's a 3 or 5 year grant funding cycle, it makes it very hard to demonstrate that. I think the committee is aware that the vast majority of Alaska tribes don't receive BIA, public safety and justice funding. And so most all of that funding is through competitive grants through the Department of Justice. We believe that Alaska tribes should be provided dedicated annual non-competitive base funding to sustain the justice systems, and that law enforcement is a key component of that justice system. Certainly courts are important, as are the codes of the written laws that Nikki mentioned earlier, but the law enforcement or the cops function is just as important.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And I know, Ms. Goodluck, you have your hand raised as well. Have a comment?
Yes, thank
Please
you.
go
And
ahead.
first off, let me quickly introduce myself. This is my first time before the committee. My name is Tracy Canard Goodluck. I'm a member of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. I'm also Muskogee Creek, and I'm the newly appointed senior advisor to Assistant Secretary Brian Newland here at the Department of Interior. And I just want a couple of things I heard that I wanted, and questions that you asked that I wanted to comment on. And first off, thank all the my fellow panelists. I'm really inspired by the work you do, and it's important and critical. And thank you to the committee for holding this really important, roundtable on this topic. First off, I want to agree with what I've heard on the topic of recruitment and retention. We're hearing all the time about the challenges and needs of trying to recruit and retain law enforcement officers in tribal communities. We're having our own recruitment challenges and retention challenges. And to address our recruitment and retention challenges, we're halfway through an internal initiative to reclassify police officer and detention officer job descriptions to ensure that at a minimum our officers receive the same rate of pay as their counterparts in other DOI bureaus. We believe that one should not have to take a pay cut to serve their tribal community. So parity and equity are a priority as part of our strategy. We're also reassessing the way we recruit, and including looking at hiring recruiters to help us and doing a better job at advertising our vacancies. We know that doing a better job at all of this and recruiting uniformed officers is not the silver bullet solution, but we believe it's one part of our public safety strategy at Interior. And Director O'Neill might have more he wants to add later to this, but I just really also want to address, that I agree with Ms. Simpson that, relationship building and community policing is a really critical part of public safety and justice. And I think Senator Murkowski mentioned it at the top of the hearing, is that, our tribal communities know best what they need. And I would say that we here at Interior believe that as well. Our tribal communities have the answers, and we're looking at ways to support that. This is a priority of ours. I would say tribal public safety and justice in tribal communities in Indian country is Secretary Holland's, priority. It's our priority here at Indian Affairs, and we're committed to it, and really working with folks here on this call, but also across Indian country on developing solutions to these issues. And going to the Alaska point, I recently was able to travel with Assistant Secretary Newland and a team of folks here at Indian Affairs up to Alaska. It was a life-changing experience for me, being able to be in the tribal communities, in rural Native villages, listening to what the issues are. And I would say that we heard public safety and justice issues everywhere we went, from Southeast Alaska all the way up to the Northwest and in between. We're in several different places. And so we are committed to continuing to dialogue and work with our folks up in Alaska on solutions that will work for them when it comes to their tribal law enforcement issues and public safety needs.
Thank you. And then finally, Chief Ford, you have your hand raised, and then I have one more question after this for Mr. Chapman.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you, Ms. Simpson and Ms. Goodluck. I just wanted to mention that unfortunately, a lot of times in law enforcement, our relationship with community is based in crisis. And sometimes when you have a relationship that's based in crisis, people from the community only see us or have an experience with us when something bad happens. And that's a difficult way to build trust and build rapport with the community. It's also a difficult thing to fund and support. I think there's a very special relationship between law enforcement and Native communities um, with the people that they serve. Um, I've worked in both city and tribal law enforcement, and there's ability in Native communities for everyone to have a voice and for everyone to be heard and for there to be some input. But I think if there were some strategies to find a way to support those positive relationships that weren't based in crisis, then when those crises do occur, then the community is working with people that they know and that they trust. And so I'm not sure exactly how you can fund trust and rapport, but I think that's an important strategy that needs to be looked at.
Wonderful, thank you. Let me ask one final question here, and this is for Mr. Chapman. The COPS office administers the Tribal Access Program, which was codified in the 2002 reauthorization of VAWA. How can the Tribal Access Program help address the MMIW or MMIP? And what can Congress do to ensure that tribes have access to this information? Mr. Chapman, can you respond to that?
Yes, thank you, ma'am, for that important question. And thanks to you and your colleagues for your support of the department's Tribal Access Program. Of course, TAP provides tribes access to national criminal information databases for law enforcement purposes. It allows tribes to more effectively serve and protect their nation's citizens by ensuring that there can be an exchange of critical data. COPS has funded TAP for $3 million in each of the last several fiscal years to continue the expansion of TAP. And we anticipate another application period opening this fiscal year, which will have a direct impact on the ability of tribes to access critical data and information to assist and address the disproportionate high rates of violence that we know are experienced by Native Americans, and relatedly, the high rates of Indigenous persons that are reported missing. As you know, DOJ launched TAP for the National Crime Information in August of 2015, and it's expanded each year. There are currently 108 tribes with over 450 tribal government agencies participating in TAP, and again, our goal is to expand that number each year. So again, we appreciate the support that we've received to help expand TAP. In terms of the relationship to MMIP and it being a powerful tool to address those issues, TAP can help by enabling access to NCIC, the missing persons file within NCIC. We know that over 18,000 criminal justice agencies from 50 U.S. states, Indian country, territories, and Canada enter records into the NCIC missing persons file. And that, of course, is managed by the FBI's Criminal Justice Information Services Division, or CJIS. But that access means that agencies can both report missing persons and identify existing missing persons report for possible matches in the system. So again, it's a powerful tool in support of MMIP, but more needs to be done to expand TAP access.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone. I understand.
Thank you.
Senator Schatz? Chairman
Yeah,
Schatz.
I'm back. Thank you very much, Senator Cortez Masto. I don't want you to miss your vote either. Thank you very much. Mr. Patterson, aloha. Thank you for your leadership in helping Hawaii to have a vision for its juvenile justice system that focuses on community-based interventions for at-risk youth and culturally based healing. Can you tell us more about how this approach came about at Kawailoa Youth and Family Wellness Center?
Around 2006, 2007, our juvenile system was under scrutiny by the federal government. And at that time, changes were needed. And our family court judges basically said, we don't want to put children in cells anymore. Yeah, that was a judiciary decision from the family court system on all the counties. And they made a commitment under the leadership of our Judge Mark Browning. And they began working with the Office of Youth Service in creating a system of diversion. Yeah, of programs that we were not giving consequences out for crimes committed by juveniles. We just were providing a more active probationary programmatic journey for the child before considering any kind of incarceration. And so what basically happened in less than a 10-year period, the reduction of the incarcerated population was 83%. Yeah, based on the community involvement and the courts diverting the children from incarceration. So what you got is a lot of your low-level children were no longer going to prison for mere status offenses. We're not going to send a child to prison for running away or not going to school. Yeah. And so what basically happened is that you got the most vulnerable of your high-risk children ending up in the incarcerated facility, who basically support systems were almost zero. Yeah. And that led to really looking on about 2014, when I was brought into the system. I was asked to how do we sustain the reform, knowing that the children don't have to be incarcerated. They're going through these programs, but are we just delaying their incarceration? You know, because we're looking at, we can provide them with wraparound services up until about 18, but what happens after age out? Yeah. So our focus is beginning to emerge in terms of what do we do for our 18 to 24-year-olds aging out of foster care, aging out of mental health, aging out of judiciary. Yeah. And how do we sustain them in what we all know is a difficult period of 18 to 24 for those of us in the population that don't have issues in the judicial system. Yeah. Kawailoa Youth and Family Wellness Center was the next step in Hawaii's efforts in sustaining a juvenile justice reform by looking at the populations within our juvenile and young adult community that was not being affected by the reform. We looked at homeless minors. We were looking at mental health, yeah, for minors. Hawaii's averages about 40 of our youth a year are sent to the continental U.S. for dual diagnosis mental health treatment. We want to know, how do we keep them home? Yeah, we're looking at, in 2014, Hawaii decriminalized prostitution for minors. Yeah, looking at them as victims in terms of our increasingly awareness of sex trafficking here in Hawaii. So we developed programs on campus in terms of having a CSEC assessment center for minors. Yeah. In addition to our homeless shelter for 18 to 24-year-olds, because we had issues with minors, because Hawaii has we cannot congregate minors in housings. They become the jurisdiction of child welfare. Yeah. So in the period of the forming of the Kawailoa Youth and Family Wellness Center, we had to actually advocate at the legislative level to change policy and laws to allow us to take care of minors that we are finding that are homeless. Yeah. And then finally, in addition to the correctional facility, we have a high school that deals with high risk coming out of our Department of Education as well, and vocational training, yeah, for our 14 to 24-year-olds. We're finding that Kawailoa Youth and Family Wellness Center is advocating for the most vulnerable of our high risk youth in Hawaii, and we're seeing continuing ability to sustain our reform and keeping our children out of prison. And now we're focusing and beginning to focus on keeping our young adults out of the adult system. In this way, we hope to affect the overcrowding that is occurring in our adult system with the young generations that are coming up.
So I have one follow-up question and then another question on another topic. First of all, thank you for everything you're doing, and I think the committee will certainly look at everything that you're doing at Kawailoa and elsewhere as an example that we may be able to, replicate across the country. I'm particularly interested in the question of when you age out of eligibility for services, mental health, foster care, whatever it may be. I used to work in the mental health space, and especially coming out of incarceration, you're getting a certain amount of mental health care. You may even have a prescription for what you need. And then a lot of times you're just released. And the only way you can get the care that you need is to re-hospitalize or re-incarcerate. And I'm wondering, Mr. Patterson, whether the mechanics of the handoff have been fully fleshed out. I know, you're under, let's say you're a kid, you're under the the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Division of the Department of Health, and then you're supposed to be under the jurisdiction of the Adult Mental Health Division of the Department of Health. But the thing is, they have different intake. You can't just get handed off. It's the same thing that happens with, DOD medical care to VA. It's not as seamless as it needs to be. And I'm wondering whether there's something that you've learned or something that we need to focus on to get that transition to be as seamless as possible. And maybe there's a flurry of activity on the back end administratively, but for the recipient of care, it should be totally seamless. In fact, in my view, you shouldn't have to switch case managers or clinicians or anyone. Your life should just continue. Just because you made 18 doesn't mean you don't have challenges. So wondering if you have any thoughts about how to execute on the transition.
What we are finding when we first opened our 18 to 24-year-old homeless shelter, it was also a day drop-in. And a lot of the day drop-ins were minors, that we weren't allowed to house in the beginning because of the laws in Hawaii. Now, we're discovering through our homeless program the gaps in the systems that you are talking about. And what happens is some of these children, they're in therapeutic foster care, or they're in mental health with families. And then as they approach 18, they don't get the required handoff paperwork done prior to their 18th year. So there is a system within the Department of Health that gives a final interview of a child, mental health issues, that when they turn 18, they can take that paperwork and all their services is transitioned into the adult mental health community. And that's a big gap right now, because a lot of these kids that are showing up at 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds don't have that discharge paperwork that proves that they were in the mental health system as juveniles.
Which is just totally crazy. I mean, the same thing happens, by the way, and less so now, but certainly in the Department of Defense, especially when you're going to enter civilian life, you come home from a war, the very last thing that they used to ask you before you get to see your family is, are you experiencing any mental health difficulties or distress? And if you say you are, then your ability to see your family in that moment is delayed by hours or even a day or two. And so everybody says, I'm fine, right? Because I want to go with my wife. And I do think that we need to pay more attention to the mechanics, because since I was in the not-for-profit social service agency, this has been a problem, and yet it's absurd that even still, we are failing these young people as they transition from being 17 to 18, as if something fundamentally changed with them. It's our problem to try to make this transition seamless. So I know my staff is going to be visiting with you in June, and we just really appreciate your work. One final question is on the trauma-informed initiative at the Women's Community Correctional Facility. Can you just tell us a little bit about that and how it works?
Before I answer that, Senator, I just wanted to comment on the conversation I heard prior to you asking me these questions in regards to law enforcement. In Hawaii, law enforcement are a crucial element of the diversion program. We look at them as first responders, not in terms of the crisis, but being able to see the crisis before it happens. And really, our job here as a campus is really to work with law enforcement and saying, hey, when you see this, call these numbers. Because we want to prevent the crisis from occurring. They see the family, they see the child behavior as an effect of the family, and they have all the ground knowledge in order to transition or hand off to an organization, a nonprofit, a faith-based, in order to help deal with the family so that they don't have to revisit the family again. It's really a community effort, and understanding that law enforcement sees things before everybody else and have the ability to move a family in the right direction if we provide him with the tools for his belt to make that transition. Yeah. And so that's really key and helpful in our diversion programs in Hawaii and dealing with our juveniles.
Thank you very much. Oh, sorry. I'm going to let you answer the question I asked about trauma-informed programs.
Trauma-informed care became a real work in progress when I took over the Women's Community Correctional Center back in 2007. And it was really understanding, having worked 20 years with the men and then being thrown into a female facility was very challenging for me. Yeah. And from a Native perspective, and the fact that we're such a matriarchal society, when I went in there and seen an amount of Native Hawaiian women in there, it was really a shock for me because, I felt like they have not, or were never taught, their role in the maintaining of culture, yeah, of oral history, of language. And it was really, how do I get them back on track? And understanding that a lot of the women were in there for nonviolent crimes, yeah, all drug related. And the fact that almost 80 or 90% of the women suffered from PTSD, yeah. And when we begin to understand the profile of the women, of trauma in terms of sexual abuse, mental trauma, emotional trauma, physical trauma, and drug and addiction that comes with that, it's really you running a treatment center. Yeah. And that's when we began using trauma as a means of moving away from a punitive system here in Hawaii and incorporating cultural programming with Western programming, because we're Hawaiians living in another culture and using two means of treatment to bring a woman back to where she needs to be and reunite with family. Yeah. Trauma-informed care system, and when you look at a correctional setting, you cannot just focus on the internal workings of the programs within the facility. You need to focus on the system. How do we create programs prior to the incarceration so that we don't incarcerate them? So we want to work with the women at the time of arrest and during the whole probationary and pre-trial period in order to keep them out of the prison system. Once at the prison system, you get the more vulnerable ones and you work with them. Then you create the transition so that they can be successful and not return. It's a systems approach to dealing with the trauma issues. Yeah, this is not an overnight journey. This is a life journey. Teaching the women how to cope with the trauma that they've had, and it's a difficult thing. Culture is at its best in taking the inside dive in our Native women so that they can break the barriers, so that they can deal with the trauma that they've experienced, so that they can be successful and become who they should be within the culture and in the society to their families. That's really a quick look at it, but it was important to note that as we got more into the trauma, we brought community in, we got staff buy-in, administration enforcement, community, changed the physical environment from punitive to therapeutic. We began to see an overcrowded women's system. The beds begin to open up. Women weren't coming back. The courts weren't sending them into there. Our programs were being successful, and we were able to bring home all the women that were once housed in the mainland that couldn't fit in Hawaii. We brought them home. So we're very proud of what we do and what we continue to do. We cannot resolve all the societal issues that bring women into our criminal justice system. So we need to create a place knowing that they're coming to heal them.
Thank you so much. Amazing, and we look forward to working with you. Senator Daines.
Chairman Schatz, thank you. Thanks for holding this very informative discussion. I have heard from tribes across Montana that there is a severe, I think severe isn't a strong enough word, we can call it crisis, whatever, lack of law enforcement on tribal lands. It is out of control. It's an ongoing crisis surrounding meth and fentanyl across our state. This is coming from Mexican cartels. We are a northern border state that's being flooded with Mexican cartel drugs, and our tribes are feeling a lot of the brunt of it. The problem is particularly devastating to our tribal communities. This crisis, coupled with a law enforcement presence that's lacking, has created a devastating environment. I've heard it from tribe after tribe, whether I'm back home in Montana or hearing it in my office just in the last 2 weeks. 2 different tribes being in my office talking about horrible stories of what's happening right now with lawlessness and lack of law enforcement on the reservations. It's high crime rates. It's very, very sad stories of suicide and a low police presence. It's a recipe for disaster. I sent a letter to the Department of Interior in October of 21 with concerns surrounding the lack of law enforcement personnel in Montana to ensure the safety of our tribal communities. And the response I received from DOI simply acknowledged the lack of personnel, and that was it. I've heard extensively from the tribes in Montana that there is a disconnect between BIA and the tribes. And everybody here, I think, knows what Indian country thinks BIA stands for. If you don't know, I'm happy to fill you in one-on-one. I have a question for Ms. Simpson, who proudly is here from Montana, from Lame Deer. I've heard from Montana's tribal leaders that they want to be doing more, but they feel handcuffed by the federal government. How do you think we can better promote tribal sovereignty and self-determination so tribes can better address the safety issues that affect them in Montana?
Thank you, Senator Daines. I appreciate your hard work for Montana on behalf of the Indian tribes here, especially with regard to murdered and missing Indigenous women issues. So thank you for your support. I think, you know, it really comes down to resources, and that goes beyond, you know, certainly personnel with law enforcement is a big part of that, but resources at every single level. I think one thing that we often tend to focus on is Department of Justice funding for tribes, and, you know, and law enforcement funding for tribes, and we forget about the very, very important funding that comes from the Department of Health and Human Services through the Family Violence and Prevention Services Act, which is the only source of funding in Indian country for shelters.
And Ms. Simpson, though, just to cut to the chase, I've chatted with your Northern Cheyenne leaders, Crow leaders, Fort Belknap, Blackfeet. From what I've heard on law enforcement, it's not a funding issue. They've got the head count. They can't fill the spots.
Yes, well, I think that that's a big issue as well. And I think there were some conversations going on earlier about how to, you know, some of the things that we need to do to better recruit local people from our own communities, from our own nations, to be able to serve in those law enforcement positions. I think that's a big way to help build trust within our communities between our tribal members and our law enforcement, is to have people from our own communities filling those spots, rather than outsiders who do not understand families and culture, and so that's a big part of it, I think.
Yeah, I know I think I've heard the same thing. Is we'll have these outstanding, qualified individuals who are from the reservation, grew up there. In fact, we've had some that have gone off serving our country in the military. They come back, they want to help their people. The problem is the background checks that are required to clear take far longer than any other law enforcement group back home, whether it's sheriff, highway patrol, or city police. And when you have outstanding individuals coming up from Indian country who it's going to take 6 to 12 months to clear a background check, they can't wait that long and remain unemployed. So there's solutions out there, and it's not funding related. It is just unblocking some of these onerous processes of getting these physicians filled. And I appreciate your thoughts on more of the homegrown talent, because that's oftentimes the best way to build trust, certainly in any country. I've got a question for Mr. O'Neill. How can BIA work towards a better relationship with Montana tribes on the topic of law enforcement? Because I'm hearing the relationship is not good at the moment across many of our tribes in Montana.
Senator Daines, I appreciate that question. And Anytime that we look to build trust and respect, and I heard Director Simpson talk about this earlier, it really comes down to communication, honesty, transparency, and ensuring that we're fulfilling the trust responsibilities that our office has to Indian country. We have been working on that. Through the pandemic, we had some challenges for in-person meetings, and we were able to implement some technology to overcome these challenges. And now, in fact, I've even heard from a number of tribes that they'd like these virtual capabilities to join meetings and consultations permanently moving forward. That we found in many situations, our staff have performed their responsibilities admirably. However, we haven't always been the best at communicating these successes. We're consistently looking for opportunities to effectively communicate with our tribal leaders, and we understand that we can do a better job, and want to ensure that we're a strong partner in ensuring safe tribal communities.
So just with all due respect, these issues predated the pandemic. I just take a little bit of issue with saying this is pandemic related. These issues have been going on for a long time in Indian country because we've been working on them, and I know our tribes are frustrated because they're not seeing the progress needed to just get the boots on the ground. Again, it's not a funding issue. It's the bureaucracies. We see what it takes, BIA, how long to go through the hiring process to get these new members of law enforcement actually out enforcing the law and keeping these tribal communities safe. As I've done in previous years, I've introduced a resolution to designate May 5th as the National Day of Awareness for Missing or Murdered Native Women and Girls. Hannah Harris was a member of the Northern Cheyenne tribe who was a victim of a horrible crime. Her birthday was May 5th, 1992. A study done by DOJ found that American Indian women face murder rates 10 times that of the national average. It's imperative that we work towards eradicating this epidemic. This committee champions Savannah's Act and the Not Invisible Act, which were signed into law under President Trump. Additionally, Operation Lady Justice was created in November of 19 to address the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis, and this was a pivotal moment. That said, despite steps forward, there's a lot of work left to be done. Mr. Chapman, while I applaud the Department of Interior's work as well as Mr. O'Neill, I'm deeply concerned with the lack of collaboration and coordination across the various federal agencies. My question is this: how can the BIA better collaborate with DOJ to fulfill the requirements that we passed in Savannah's Act and the Not Invisible Act? I'll start with Mr. O'Neill.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Daines. I can tell you, Not Invisible Act is on the Department of Interior, Section 3 OJS. We've made considerable progress. In fact, our first report's going through a clearance process right now to provide to Congress to show the progress that we've made on Section 3. Section 4, establishment of the commission, has also been a collaborative effort with the Department of Justice. We've met with them on a weekly basis on our team as we proceeded through that. And I know Senior Advisor Goodluck may have some additional information, so I'd like to defer some of my time to her.
Thank you, Director O'Neill, and thank you, Senator Daines, for the question. I agree. I couldn't agree more that coordination amongst our agencies in the federal government are key to coming up with solutions and battling this crisis of public safety and justice in our tribal communities. And I would say that a couple of things I would also mention: not only are we meeting weekly with the Department of Justice through the Not Invisible Act Commission that's just been stood up, but we're also doing this interagency coordination through the White House Council on Native American Affairs. We have a subcommittee on that called the Public Safety and Justice Subcommittee that is co-chaired by both DOI and DOJ. So we are in communication with them quite frequently on these issues. And additionally, we have the executive order on public safety and criminal justice in tribal communities and missing and murdered Indigenous peoples that requires us to work across agencies, DOI, DOJ, HHS, DHS, to coordinate our efforts on the MMIP issues. So thank you, Director O'Neill, and thank you, Senator Daines, for the question.
Yeah, and thank you. I appreciate the communication and the the groups that are meeting and talking about this. I just encourage you to go out to Browning, go out to Hayes, go out to Busby, go out to Lame Deer, go out to Croatian Sea, spend time with the people on the ground out there, these tribals and the tribal leaders, and see firsthand truly the epidemic that we're facing right now of lawlessness and the incredible tragedy that's going on right now in Indian country because of being overrun with drugs, the suicide rates, the murder rates, the violent crime rates. Talk is good. It'd be better to get out there and spend time and see it firsthand. I think it would put maybe perhaps a sense of urgency to act and get these tribes the help they need. And it starts with getting law enforcement hired and on the ground there enforcing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Daines. I want to thank all of the panelists for a really informative discussion. There's a reason we did it this way, is we wanted to have a little bit more of an open-ended conversation to inform our efforts going forward and to follow up on the good legislation that we're in the process of trying to pass, but also the bills that we've already enacted into law, because so much of this is about execution, so much of this is about coordination, but there's another piece of this, which is there are best practices being developed, and we want to share that across the country. Whoever's doing something that works ought to be sharing that and helping us to scale that across Native American communities, Alaska Native communities, Indian country, and Native Hawaiian communities. So really want to thank everybody on this panel for doing the good work, the difficult work, the necessary work, and we'll all be in touch directly through staff and follow up with legislative action and hopefully some money as well. Thanks very much.